In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Well, today we are celebrating the Feast of All Saints, which is actually this coming Wednesday, November 1st. And we're doing it today because it works today. It doesn't work next week. But we're also doing double duty today because we've been asked to celebrate something else today as well, and they go well together. Today we're asked to remember and commemorate the 500th anniversary of the beginning of the Reformation. It was October 31st, 1517, when Martin Luther sent a paper to the Bishop of Mainz containing 95 theses, his disputation concerning, among other things, the sale of indulgences. And it was this that touched off what became the Reformation. The circumstances for that we probably know fairly well. During the Renaissance, the church got really in a great debt. They were building St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and it cost, typical of any great building project, the cost overruns and stuff, and the Pope needed to raise money, and he was wholesaling indulgences. The Bishop of Mainz needed money too, and so he was getting a cut of the profits. And they had a particularly egregious seller in Germany who offered little poetic ditties and the like, trying to get people to buy these indulgences. An indulgence would get someone you loved, or perhaps yourself, out of purgatory early. The whole even concept of purgatory was a medieval construction that has, fortunately, especially in Anglicanism, has gone away. But this was what touched off the great Reformation. Martin Luther himself was a pretty special guy, brilliant, but also quirky. After an illness, he decided to become a monk because he believed that God had saved him. Became one of the more brilliant ones, a university professor in Wittenberg. He suffered for years, though, with this sense of not being worthy enough, not being good enough, not being able enough to please God. And it was through that struggle that he went back to his Augustinian roots and decided that all the stuff like indulgences and works of supererogation and the like that he was trying to do to make himself good enough to be saved were unnecessary, because salvation was a gift from God, and that we were saved by grace, only by grace, we live out through faith. And this was his great revelation. It's what caused him to write the 95 Theses and began to change the world as it happened. The world did change as a result of the Reformation. It's not the only thing that changed the world, but it was a big piece of it. And it wasn't, by the way, Martin Luther was not the first reformer who had shown up in the past few centuries, but he was the first who survived to old age. All the other ones, like Jan Hus, they met a violent end because the Pope and the state came down and they tried them as heretics and executed them. Martin Luther was different. He had a protector. Frederick, the Elector of Saxony, protected him, and the Pope's people could not get him. And he was able to stay in first Wartburg and then Wittenberg, and continued to be a leader of what became a separate church, the Lutheran Church, over time. And this touched off all kinds of different versions of Reformation throughout Europe. And then you had radical reformers in Switzerland, and eventually the Anglican Reformation happened in England, which is where our roots are. And all of these started 500 years ago this month. Something interesting to think about. By the way, one last thing, we do have more than just simply an example where Luther affected us as Anglicans. Thomas Cranmer, who wrote the Book of Common Prayer, went to Germany and studied with Luther and married a German wife and brought her back. And so we have actually a lot of cross-fertilization going on there in who it created with us. But like I said, the Reformation changed the world. After, as you know, after a period of time of these different religious sects popping up, the inevitable bad thing happened, which was the religious wars, and they were off and on in Europe for over 100 years, ending with the 30 Years' War, which was pretty much awful. That war ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. I bring that up because the Peace of Westphalia, which settled that war, was unique in that the princes of Europe got together, fashioned a peace to end the wars of religion, and didn't bother to consult the Pope at all. And the result from Peace of Westphalia was the religion of the prince will be the religion of the realm, and we will not fight each other over religion. This created the modern world because it created the modern nation state as we know it today. And that came out of the Reformation. Now, what I find interesting, and we should all find interesting, and why this has something to do with our own All Saints' Day today, is 500 years later, the world the Reformation helped create is coming apart. And we're not really sure what the world is going to look like in future generations too far down the road. The world is changing, and it's a little bit still up in the air. The world is smaller. We can travel everywhere. We know what's going on instantly all over the world now, which we didn't know 500 years ago. The old arguments that made up the Reformation arguments are strangely completely out of date, and we have new issues today. We have issues that deal with spirituality and the like. There are many who argue that we're in the middle of another great Reformation-like spiritual awakening itself, except this one isn't specifically Christian, but it is affecting the whole world. For us, I think what this means is that we need to go back to something that I think makes eminent sense of what it means to be a saint today. And that is not a doctrine, but a person. Jesus Christ. To focus on Jesus, who he was, what he said, how he lived, what his example is, that will give us a guide to living in this unknown world where we can make our way as the very first Christians did as well, not knowing what would happen, whether they would be safe or not safe, but trusting in Jesus, living according to his rules and his word. We heard that in the gospel, the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are a paradox. That word blessed, Greek makarios, means happy, fortunate, even lucky. And yet they're so paradoxical. Happy, lucky are the poor. Really? Happy, lucky are those who hunger and thirst. Are you kidding me? Happy are those who mourn. And yet, in the construct of living in the grace of God through Jesus Christ, we find a fullness and a joy which is not available anywhere else. When we live in that paradox, we never have all the answers, but we do have the grace. That same grace that Martin Luther proclaimed 500 years ago as being the only basis of salvation is still the only basis of salvation, even if we don't really understand what salvation is anymore. That grace is there, and it is full. I don't think Martin Luther had the slightest idea, nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg so that other people could read it and they could have a debate. I don't think he had any idea where that was going to lead. And I think he was surprised himself where it did lead. You and I, as we go about our work of being stewards of the gospel, we don't necessarily know exactly where it will lead. And we may be surprised from time to time. But the one thing we can count on throughout our life as the saints of God is the grace of God to continue to be with us, to support us, and to bring us that peace which is beyond all understanding. Amen.